today talk, what some people may see as a kind of more straightforward narrative about Nixon and the Watergate crisis than, say, I offer in Nixon's Shadow, which, as Jeremy said, is largely a book about image making, both how Nixon shaped his image, but also how he was perceived and understood by different groups of Americans. And although it was not written in our current age of polarization, in a way it, I think, presages some of the tendencies that developed since then, because it suggested how different groups of people really understood Nixon in fundamentally different ways, and how with Nixon in the media age, the presidency became sort of a contest of image, a contest of narrative, and I think we are very much living in that kind of a world today. But Watergate, I think there's no getting around it, is the sort of central narrative. There is, of course, more to Nixon and his presidency that one could talk about. The Vietnam War, his efforts in a way to end it, although it dragged out into his, through the first term and even a little bit into the second. Certainly, the efforts he made with China and the Soviet Union, to the opening to China, détente with the Soviet Union, and then I have the Republican elephant there. I think he really remade the Republican Party in fundamental ways, and although the populism of Donald Trump is a different kind of populism from Nixon's, that cultural populism, the effort to sort of win over those former New Deal Democrats in the wake of the backlash to the Great Society, was certainly a Nixonian project. So there's a lot more one could say than Watergate, but today we are talking about Watergate, and I do think it's important. Sometimes we hear the term a third-rate burglary. This was a line that the White House press secretary, Ron Ziegler, labeled Watergate with in an effort to downplay its importance. And it always surprises me when I hear people say, well, Watergate was just a third-rate burglary. No, that's what Ron Ziegler and Nixon wanted you to believe. In fact, it was much more serious than that, and it encompassed a whole welter of activities that went beyond the Watergate break-in. I think it's significant as both scandal and crisis, right? These are not necessarily distinct, the same category. A scandal can be petty and gossipy, but not have great consequence. And a crisis need not center on scandal. But with Watergate, the two come together in a way I think that is very significant, that accounts for why it riveted the nation for a year and a half, and I think continues to interest us ever since. There's always new books, documentaries. Whenever somebody who was remotely involved in Watergate dies, the headline on his obituary is about his role in Watergate. It really is a kind of fundamentally defining event of its time. I think it's important to look at the magnitude and scope of it, which sometimes, again, with the passage of time, can recede and blur. Here is a poster that was done, no doubt, by some anti-Nixon partisans, but it gives you a sense of just how many of these people who were central to the Nixon administration were charged and in many cases convicted of criminal behavior. 14 of his closest aides served time, 3 of his attorneys general among them. It also, those names include his campaign manager, John Mitchell, who was one of the attorneys general, his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, the White House counsel, John Dean. So it was not a handful of low-level aides. It was not sort of confined to some little faction within the White House. This really was, as the Woodward and Bernstein book and movie would have it, all the president's men. I mean, really, if not to a man, not every single one, really sweeping through the White House, through the executive branch. And the president himself was named by the prosecutor as an unindicted co-conspirator. That's one of those many catchphrases of Watergate that kind of comes down to us. Um, why is there a co on co-conspirator? A conspirator has already got the co in it. But nonetheless, they decided they weren't going to indict the president, but he was named as having had a hand in these conspiracies. Nixon himself really was at the center of the scandal, and his view of presidential power, I think, is important to understand. After the fact, after he left office, in interviews that were designed to sort of show some contrition, perhaps, to regain him a place in polite company, to get him a hearing again in the media. He sat for interviews with the British television personality David Frost. But in those interviews, he said, if the president does it, that means it is not illegal. This was his justification for so much of what he did. A truthful account of his own view, of course, not an accurate account of any known theory of the presidency under the Constitution. But I think this, in a way, gave away, even as Nixon was trying to redeem himself, the motivations and the justifications that he felt entitled him to act as he did. Now, well, before we get there. So, one of the great questions in the historiography about Watergate that I think still serves as a useful way of thinking about it is, was Watergate an outgrowth of Nixon's individual personality or deeper structural forces surrounding the presidency? On the personal side, we know Nixon to have been a deeply vindictive, and he himself described himself as paranoid personality, someone who nursed grudges against enemies, who saw, as the previous quote suggests, power as a way of rewarding friends and allies and punishing his adversaries. He also grew up, and the Nixon's Shadow book is sort of partly about this, in the age of television, public relations, advertising, when these new tools were coming to be the central tools of the presidency. And he accommodated himself to these with a special avidity, of special eagerness. And his White House tapes are full, as well as other memos and so on, full of comments about how he can find a television advisor to tell him whether to hold the phone with his left hand or his right hand, questions such as these. So there was something in him, even more than most politicians who are an approval-seeking lot. Even more than most, Nixon was trying to create an image that would endear him to the public, to the press, and indeed to the history books. He also thrived on polarization. Again, that's a word that we're used to in our own times, but Nixon actually spoke of a strategy that he called positive polarization. He recognized that he could build up his own strength, his own base, by demonizing those who were against him, whether that was the anti-war protesters, the liberals, the media, the intellectuals, and so on. And so all of these personality qualities, I think, played an important role in the Watergate scandal. On the other hand, there were also structural forces. You see there the book by Arthur Schlesinger Jr., The Imperial Presidency. This is a term we give, as you may know, to the development of the presidency, perhaps starting with FDR, perhaps starting with Harry Truman, but in the World War II and Cold War era, where the presidency increasingly takes on substantial powers unchecked. This comes to include a lot of adventures overseas, ranging from CIA-abetted coups and other covert actions to things like the White House tapes. No one taped 4,000 hours the way Richard Nixon did, but he was not the first to use secret tape recordings, to have secret tape recordings at least of a finite number of conversations. So that development from FDR onward some people say that, more than Nixon, was really what led us to Watergate. There was also a period in the 60s and 70s that was a true crisis of authority. If you think about the assassination of Kennedy, the protests against Lyndon Johnson, and the war that basically forced him not to run again, there was a sense that the president's hold on the nation, his hold on power, was not what it once was. And this crisis of authority is extended to the military, to other institutions, the church. There was, with the generation gap, the 60s generation sort of challenging authority, this pervaded many spheres of American life. So perhaps this, too, is a structural development that we need to think about along with Nixon's personality. And then finally, obviously, there's no getting around the strife over the Vietnam War. This is the context in which Nixon takes office. He comes in with a lot of people already dead set against him. He's already hostile to them, whether it's Democrats or protesters. So that simply intensifies and spirals downward through his presidency. Now, before the break-in, there are a whole series of other incidents. And this is why I think it's very important not to get caught in the thinking of Watergate as just a third-rate burglary, just as one incident. White House horrors was the term given by John Mitchell, the Attorney General. There was really a whole complex of White House activities, the Watergate burglary being one of these many. Early in Nixon's presidency, the first few months, he and Henry Kissinger put secret wiretaps on members of the National Security Council, on various journalists. They're upset about leaks, particularly regarding the bombing of Cambodia, or I guess the invasion of Cambodia at first. And this is sort of the first step in a whole series of covert or clandestine operations that skirt the law, in some cases explicitly violate the law. Soon after come the secret White House tapes. So the wiretaps on journalists and on certain employees of the White House is one thing. Then Nixon sets up the tape recorders in the Oval Office, Camp David, a few other locations, to record almost anything he wants recorded about what is going on. And of course, this is done without the knowledge of the people he's talking to, and really with the knowledge of only a tiny handful of White House staff. A unit called the Plumbers is created. The joke is they're plumbers because they plug leaks. And again, this gets to Nixon's personal qualities, the paranoia, the fear of not having control, and the notion that his conversations, all presidents, of course, rail against leaks. Some handle it better than others, but very few set up a special White House spying unit to fight it. And that's what the Plumbers did. They committed other burglaries besides the Watergate. There was the break-in of Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, Ellsberg being the former Pentagon employee who had leaked the Pentagon Papers, a sort of government history of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The rat term, that's one that refers to a whole kind of panoply of dirty campaign tricks that Nixon's people got involved in advance of the 72 election, trying to wound Democratic candidates like Edmund Muskie, Ted Kennedy, who they thought might pose a threat to Nixon's reelection. They very much wanted to run against McGovern, which is who they got. And of course, the fact that the Watergate break-in was at the Democratic headquarters suggests that this continued even after McGovern became the nominee. At one point, Gordon Liddy, one of the plumbers, quite seriously discusses the assassination of the journalist Jack Anderson. Again, that's not the kind of thing, we've had we've had plenty of presidents who've railed against leaks, who've railed against media hostility. I don't think any have quite gone that far. I mean, that wasn't Nixon, but it was, was an important figure in his administration. And then finally, these many abuses, attempts to use the FBI, the IRS against his enemies. When he found out someone was attacking him, they compiled the so-called enemies list, which included politicians and journalists, but also celebrities like Joe Namath and Carol Channing, who maybe spoke out critically against Nixon, as we know celebrities often do, these days as well, if they are unhappy with the president and want to make a political statement. So Nixon would try to, with some of these people, audit their taxes, harass them in various ways, really abusing these institutions of the law that are, of course, meant to be used, not in a vindictive, personal way. The Watergate break-ins, and I say break-ins because there were actually two, which is a sort of sometimes forgotten wrinkle of the story, occur in May and June of 1972. The idea is to place wiretaps on the phones of some of the Democratic officials who have their offices there in the Watergate building you see along the Potomac River. It so happened that the first set of taps didn't work very well. So the second break-in, the June 17th break-in, was designed to sort of fix the taps in part. I think they also were going to place some new ones on some additional phones. And it was there, of course, that these burglars were apprehended when a security guard found a piece of tape on the door and, evidence that there was a fairly sophisticated burglary going on. Again, you really wouldn't call it third rate given the amount of equipment and preparation and planning that Gordon Liddy had led them through. So people sometimes say, well, it wasn't the crime, it was the cover-up. This is another idea I'd like to urge you to reconsider, push back on. I think both the crime and the cover-up were quite significant here in Richard Nixon's case. The crime part, as I said, was not just that break-in I've just described, but all those other break-ins. At least we know there was the Ellsberg break-in, there were other break-ins that were discussed, there were other abuses of power, other dirty tricks. So it wasn't a single crime that Nixon simply could have owned up to and apologized for. This ran too deep. It was too deeply embedded in Nixon's view of power, in the way his White House had been set up and constructed. That said, the cover-up was quite significant as well. It involved first the systematic destruction of documents. Once these men were arrested on June 17, 1972, White House aides systematically and hastily destroyed a great deal of the evidence of how they were paid and who they were working for. Nixon himself was directly involved in this. He met with his top aides in the days after the burglars were apprehended to discuss, how do we handle this? What do we do? That would have been the moment when he could have come clean. He could have owned up to it and perhaps taken a political hit but survived. But he went forward, and in these early meetings, and you'll be reading, if you haven't read already, transcripts of those White House tapes, one of which features Nixon hatching a plot to have the CIA tell the FBI not to investigate this break-in, that it would go too deep. And this was a lie. This was a cover story that they came up with as a way of trying to shoo the FBI off the trail. The idea was you would claim there were national security concerns, so they shouldn't poke around. And the fact that some of the burglars were also involved with the Bay of Pigs, which was the 1961 disastrous invasion of Cuba in an attempt to help overthrow Castro. Um, that has led to a lot of conspiracy theories about, what the connections were between Kennedy and Watergate, the Kennedy assassination. In fact, the connection was they were a few of the same men, and Nixon seized on the involvement of these same men as a way to create a cover story that he hoped would throw off the press and also the FBI. Now, ultimately, Nixon backed down, but he had already done the deed. He had already authorized this lie to the CIA, and so that becomes a chief indictment eventually in the impeachment counts. The cover-up includes a public component too. For a year and a half, he denies publicly, and all his press secretaries and spokesmen and surrogates deny that anyone in the White House involved. And then again, you'll see in the second transcript, there's the payment of money to the men, the burglars who were apprehended, as well as Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, who were their supervisors. And that payment of them not to speak at trial, to perjure themselves at trial, is obviously a central part of the cover-up as well. There's a lot to be said, which I'll have to just cursorily skip through tonight, about how this all comes to be unraveled. We have a little bit of a myth that it was all the press. Well, the press played an important part. In particular, a few journalists, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein there at the Washington Post, young reporters from the Metro desk. It's often speculated that had they been the Washington Post top White House reporters, they might not have pursued the story so vigorously, because it would have perhaps seemed, they would have been in tighter with their sources. These sources would have assured them it didn't go much higher, and they might have been more inclined to accept it at face value. At least that's what some of the Washington Post reporters felt, that as young guys on the Metro desk, they were sort of uniquely positioned to kind of pursue this from scratch. But there were others besides Woodward and Bernstein. It wasn't just them, although a lot of the press was surprisingly derelict for much of 1972 and doesn't start paying attention till 73. In early 73, the Senate convenes a select committee led by Sam Ervin of North Carolina, who you see there. At the same time, the courts are working their way. You have that trial of the original burglars proceeding through the courts. Some of these people are lying under oath, but others come clean and start telling what they know. And then this leads to the appointment of a special prosecutor. Here shown is Archibald Cox, who had been Solicitor General in the Kennedy administration, a Harvard law professor. And he's given a great deal of independent power to pursue this, so much so that Nixon has him fired in October in a move that really backfires and forces Nixon to then appoint a new special prosecutor, Leon Jaworski of Texas. By the fall of 73, Nixon is really on the ropes. This is after the so-called Saturday Night Massacre, after that firing of Cox that leads to the resignation of the Attorney General and leads many, even pro-Nixon media outlets to start calling for his impeachment. Soon thereafter, there's an investigation into his taxes, and that's actually the famous "I am not a crook" line comes from that, but it seems to more broadly have stayed with us because just of the bizarre and historically strange position of the president having to deny his own criminality, which he did at Disney World, no less. By the spring, early summer of 1974, the House has decided to move forward with impeachment. There has been a big struggle between Nixon and the House, as well as the special prosecutor, about the disposition of his tapes. The tapes have been discovered through the Senate testimony. A man named Alex Butterfield, who was one of the few people who knew about them, admits under oath in his Senate testimony that many of these conversations were recorded. Naturally, the prosecutor wants to get hold of those tapes. Naturally, the House that's investigating wants to get hold of those tapes. Nixon claims executive privilege. The argument is, these are private. I need my aides to be able to trust that their advice to me will forever remain private, or the president will not get the best advice, much the way we honor a lawyer-client privilege or other such privileges. Well, executive privilege has been honored before, but in this case, it's decided by the courts that executive privilege cannot be used as a shield against potential criminality in the White House. And the Supreme Court rules 8-0 against Nixon when it comes to turning over some of these critical tapes. Again, one of them, you will read a portion of the transcript tonight. So this allows the House Judiciary Committee to finish up its work. It issues indictments or counts of impeachment on obstruction of justice, abuse of power being some of those things like how he used the IRS and FBI against his enemies, and then also his defiance of the congressional subpoenas, that itself becomes a count. Interestingly, the House Judiciary Committee chooses not to go forward with 2 other counts. One was centered on the invasion of Cambodia, which Nixon had done without consulting Congress. But it was deemed, there were plenty of congressmen who still thought this was improper behavior on Nixon's part, but it didn't seem like a clear-cut slam dunk case. The president does have a fairly wide berth in foreign policy. Military intervention had been authorized in Vietnam, so there was at least a case that his activities in Cambodia could have been justified under that broad authorization he already had. Then there was the question about the tax returns, which had come up with "I am not a crook." There too, Congress held back, or at least the Judiciary Committee held back, saying bad behavior, reproachable behavior, but probably not impeachable behavior because it concerned a kind of personal offense, not an offense against the Constitution, which these earlier counts were seen to imply. By August, this smoking gun tape about the CIA FBI ruse is now available to Congress. Republican leaders go to the White House and essentially tell the president he's finished. He's going to get impeached. And in the Senate, he's told by Barry Goldwater, among others, leading Republican lion in the Senate, that he has maybe 10 votes in his defense. So it's looking to Nixon that there's nothing he can do to save his presidency. The tide has turned. Even most of his supporters have now concluded he's guilty of criminal and impeachable behavior. Gerald Ford, the understudied, undersung Gerald Ford, I won't play you. I have this YouTube clip embedded in here, but I won't play it in the interest of time, speaks to the nation, declaring our long national nightmare is over. And then a few weeks later, Ford makes the decision to issue a pardon to Richard Nixon. A controversial decision, to be sure, one that people still debate the merits of today, and I think it's a great sort of historical debate to have with students as well as with other historians. A lot of people felt it was undermining the claim that we heard so often during Watergate that nobody is above the law. The president is not above the law. That in this way it seemed to be letting him off. Other people argued that this was a necessary step toward national healing. And some years ago, shortly before his death, Ford was awarded the John F. Kennedy Library's Profile in Courage Award. And at least the Democrats, who mostly run the Kennedy Library or hand out that award, were convinced that, after all, maybe he had done the right thing. But again, it's a good debate to have. The pardon was one of the reasons that Ford lost to Jimmy Carter by a very narrow margin in 1976. So at the time, it was not at all popular. And, again, whether it was justified is something we can still debate. So I wind up here with an image of Nixon boarding his helicopter to fly out to San Clemente, California, relinquishing the presidency to Ford. I want to pose the question for you to think about when we get to that part of it. Do these documents help understand? Do they shed light on why Nixon has been our only president ever to resign? Do they help point to a uniqueness or a special element of his wrongdoing as opposed to many other presidents who've been engaged in scandal, others, Clinton and Trump and Andrew Johnson, who've been impeached? Nixon alone was forced to resign, and I think that's a very significant fact. And so I'd be interested in seeing if you see a connection between these tape transcripts that I've circulated and that still uniquely defining quality of Nixon's presidency. So let me end there, and I guess we'll go to some questions.